All right, so we've got a really interesting one for you today. We're going to be talking about, the essence of this fascinating interview with Barry McCarthy.
Yeah.
Now, Barry McCarthy, you probably recognize the name CFO at Netflix, CFO at Spotify, and now he's the CEO in Peloton.
Yeah, really impressive career.
It is. Talk about, navigating some huge changes in how we consume entertainment and fitness, and, what it really takes to lead at that level.
Yeah, and I think, when we look back at his journey, he provides a perspective on like growth, disruption, what it really takes to lead like high growth companies.
Hmm.
And we're going to unpack a lot of that in this summary, right? So we're going to look at how you've got into startups, his time at Netflix, his time at Spotify, and then what he's doing today at Peloton, and kind of, his overarching kind of thoughts about like leading and succeeding
Yeah.
in these high pressure environments.
So back to the beginning, right? So interesting, Barry McCarthy in the 1980s, his startup journey, it wasn't this instant success. Like in his own words, he spent 7 years, part of an investment pool, and he said, I made just about every mistake you could possibly make.
Wow.
But that ultimately gave him a clear sense of what he wanted to do.
And he realized he was an operator,
Yeah.
not an
Yeah.
investor, right? Like he wanted to actually get in the trenches, kind of get his hands dirty, be in the operations of a business,
You want to be in the game.
in the game, exactly. And I think that's a very valuable lesson for our listeners, right? Like just because you might encounter difficulties initially,
Yeah.
doesn't mean that that's not leading you down the right path. It's about learning from those mistakes, like taking those lessons and applying them.
Absolutely. And he certainly did that when you consider in 1999, right? 1999, he joins Netflix, employee number 40.
40.
Think about that. Like the company was still in its infancy. I mean, they're doing this a la carte DVD rental service.
It's like the Wild West of streaming, right? Like it's crazy to even like think about that.
That's a totally different Netflix.
Yeah, like Blockbuster's the king.
Yeah.
Nobody really like knows how this is all going to play out. But so I think what's really important is that like this is all happening with the backdrop of Reed Hastings, right? Reed Hastings comes in already super successful, right? He had this company culture software. He sold that company, made a bunch of money. And he saw Netflix as like this do-over. Like he's like, I know how to build a culture. I know how to run a company. This is my chance to do it again.
Right.
And what's interesting is he brought in Patty McCord, who we all know about from the Netflix culture deck and, rebuilding the team.
Yeah.
And McCarthy joined during this moment.
Right.
So that's a super important thing.
At that moment, it feels like there's so much potential, but like you don't know where it's going. And as we all know, right, the subscription model.
Game changer.
Huge.
Huge.
Like it's the point at which it just took off. I mean, he said it was, like essentially they were doubling year after year, years of crazy growth.
Right.
What's that even like to be in that environment?
It's probably a lot of fun, probably a lot of hard work, probably a lot of stress. But I think the takeaway here, right, is that it really shows you that they found this amazing product market fit. And that business model, the subscription model, just like unlocked the potential.
Right.
And I think what was really interesting is McCarthy said his motivation for even joining, was like kind of funny. It's like, I was just like bored.
That's it, right? Running from boredom.
Yeah, he's like, I got to do something. But I think more importantly, it was the team aspect.
Yeah.
Like he said, it's like playing in an orchestra. You're surrounded by these talented people. You're working together. You're creating something, much greater than you could do on your own.
Totally.
And I think that's a really good point for, our listeners to think about, right? Like, are you in an environment where you feel stimulated, you're with great people, and you're kind of creating something that's meaningful?
Right. So we go from, the sun of California to the colder Stockholm, Sweden. Right. So he joined Spotify.
Yeah.
Now, this was, kind of a surprise to many. And, we know that he's got this connection with music. He was with Music Choice. He was on the board of Pandora. So what do you think was the main driver for him to make this move?
Yeah, it was definitely a head scratcher for a lot of people. But, reading between the lines, it seems like he had this like deep admiration for Daniel Ek.
Yeah.
He really respected his kind of like pattern recognition. He even compared him to like Reed Hastings and that ability to see things that other people don't see.
Yeah.
So I think that was a big draw. Stockholm itself wasn't initially like his ideal location. He's a California guy.
Right.
He kind of joked about the long summer days, which are amazing, and then the
Mhm.
winters, which are, like dark and cold and long. But he did say that, like the whole experience, it actually brought him and his wife closer.
Yeah.
So I think it ended up being a really positive experience.
Well, and the admiration was definitely mutual. I mean, Daniel Ek famously described him as the best strategic CFO deal maker in the world.
Yeah.
So what do you think was at the heart of that really successful partnership?
Yeah, like what a compliment. Right. And I think, McCarthy's his reaction was kind of, yeah, yeah, that's nice, whatever. He doesn't like dwell on it too much. But I think it really came down to this strong alignment,
Yeah.
right? Like they had complementary skills. McCarthy was this finance whiz deal maker, and he was coming in to like address some of the kind of like early stage uh, kind of messiness, I guess, of Spotify's financial structure.
Hmm.
Eek was the product guy, the tech guy, the visionary, and they each really like stayed in their lane, so to speak.
Right.
Like they did what they were good at. They trusted each other.
Yeah.
And that created this like really powerful synergy. And I think, for those listening, it's a great example of like finding partners whose skills actually like enhance and complement your own.
Yeah. So let's talk about a deal, that was pretty unconventional, like this direct listing for Spotify. And, McCarthy was right at the heart of this. So for those who are maybe unfamiliar, what is a direct listing? How is it different from a traditional IPO? And why was it such a good fit, the right drug, as McCarthy called it, at that moment for Spotify?
Yeah, so, McCarthy makes it clear, like, a direct listing isn't for everyone. It's not like this one-size-fits-all solution.
Hmm.
But Spotify was in this unique situation, like billions in cash. They didn't need more money.
Right.
So the traditional IPO route, right, would have meant, issuing new shares, diluting existing shareholders
Yeah.
to raise money they didn't even need, which, like, doesn't really benefit those investors.
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So McCarthy, had this, like, kind of crazy idea.
Right.
And he pitched it to Eek, and Eek was like, let's do it. Like, he was immediately on board.
Wow. So how does it actually work, though? Because it's like you're going public, but you're not initially selling stock. Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, so basically they adapted this structure that's usually used in, like, bankruptcies or corporate spinoffs.
Okay.
And they kind of, like, cleverly applied it to the IPO market. So they went public, but without this underwritten offering of new shares.
Okay.
So existing shareholders could just directly sell their shares on the open market.
Got it.
And McCarthy kind of cleared up this common misconception.
Right.
He's like, the way the stock starts trading, like day one, it's the same in both direct listings and IPOs.
So it's not like, there's no difference in terms of like how it opens. It's just the mechanics of how it gets there.
Exactly.
Got it. But then, if it works so well for Spotify, why aren't we seeing more direct listings?
Yeah, well, McCarthy points to like the current environment.
Right.
Like a lot of public company shares, they're trading at a discount.
Mm-hmm.
So traditional IPO like often relies on that big pop on the first day, right?
Right.
To get investors excited. But that usually requires selling new shares, which is like the opposite of what a direct listing does.
Right, right. Yeah. So different situations, different times.
Exactly.
So fast forward, right? He joins Peloton as CEO. He's already retired.
Living the good life.
He's a Peloton user. He knows the investors. So what made him come out of retirement, take on, this huge challenge leading a company that's facing, some significant headwinds?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of things. He saw these business challenges that were like familiar. He'd
Yeah.
been there before.
Right.
He knew what levers to pull, potentially. There's also the allure, right,
Yeah.
of another big game, leading an iconic brand. Initially, they talked about a COO role, but then he talked to Daniel Ek. He talked to Tim Haley, who's this, like, seasoned VC. And they're like, no, you got to be CEO.
Go big or go home.
Yeah, like, why mess around? And for him, it was about having the final say in the turnaround.
Yeah.
He didn't have this pre-existing, like, trust relationship with the founders.
Yeah.
He needed that authority to, like, implement change.
Right.
And he also talked about, like, the emotional resilience that's required
Yeah.
to be a CEO in a turnaround.
Yeah.
He described it as, like, constant firefighting, like you're just always putting out fires.
Right.
And he even compared it to, like, like an endurance ride.
Yeah.
which, a lot of Peloton users can probably relate to.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously he's worked alongside, some exceptional leaders. I mean, Reed Hastings. What were some of the big takeaways, from that time at Netflix?
I think the two that really stood out were, first, the business model is everything.
The foundation.
It's the foundation.
Right.
If you don't have a good business model, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter how good your product is, how smart your team is, you're not going to succeed long term.
Mm.
And then the other one, talent density.
Yeah.
Right. Getting the most people in the room,
Yeah.
having them work together, and then maximizing their potential.
Yeah.
Those two things I think are just crucial. For anyone listening, think about those things in your own business, in your own team.
For sure. So when we think about talent density, right?
Yeah.
Peloton, what's their secret sauce?
Well, McCarthy believes it boils down to two main things.
Okay.
They've got this golden brand
Yeah.
and a platinum user experience.
Mm-hmm.
Despite all the challenges they've had, that core product market fit, it's still strong.
Right.
They have this army of consumers who just love Peloton.
Oh, look.
But he also acknowledged, right, COVID was this huge thing. It was this massive marketing campaign that nobody could afford.
Right.
That drove all this growth, access to capital. But it was a double-edged sword.
It was. Because it masks, some of the underlying problems.
Exactly. And I think what's interesting is he contrasts Peloton's response to the post-COVID world with what he saw at Netflix, what he saw at Spotify under Hastings and Eek.
Right.
And he talks about their ability to pivot based on data.
Yeah.
To see these fundamental shifts coming and adapt.
Yeah.
And he suggests that Peloton maybe didn't do that as well.
Right.
And I think that's a really important lesson for, anyone listening.
It is.
You got to be able to adapt. You got to be data-driven. Things change quickly.
Totally. So he has this really interesting analogy about recruitment. He says, we're not a family. We're a professional sports team.
Yeah.
So in a practical sense, what does that even mean?
Yeah, it's tough. But it's basically saying, you got to have A players.
Yeah.
And they want to work with other A players.
Yeah.
And the focus is on winning.
Right.
Achieving success, together.
Yeah.
But there's this implication that if you're not performing,
yeah,
you're dropping the ball.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They'll swap you out for someone else who can help the team win.
Mm-hmm.
And he even shares his experience at Netflix. You could be changed at any time.
Wow.
It's kind of part of the deal.
It's the nature of the game.
Yeah.
It's high performance.
High performance.
God.
So, okay, so when you're in a company with all these complex issues, right? Problem solving, that's essential. How does McCarthy approach these challenges?
So his first step is always understand the root cause.
Get to the bottom of it.
Get to the bottom of it. He says a lot of times the way the problem's presented is just wrong.
Yeah.
It's based on bad data or people haven't really dug deep enough. So his approach is always follow the data.
Understand what's really going on.
And that takes time.
It does.
So now decision making, right?
Yeah.
Speed versus quality.
Tough balance.
How does he approach that? Because they're both really important.
Yeah. Well, he uses this framework that Jeff Bezos made popular.
Okay.
It's one-way versus two-way doors.
Okay.
So two-way doors, those are reversible decisions.
Mm.
You can try something. If it doesn't work, you can go back.
Yeah.
So for those, he's move fast.
Right.
Experiment, learn. But one-way doors, those are irreversible.
Those are the big ones.
Those are the big ones. You got to be very careful, deliberate, think things through.
Yeah.
And he also emphasizes defining success metrics before you even start something.
Okay.
With the Amazon partnership, he's okay, what does success look like?
Yeah.
Right? Are we going to get a decent margin? Are we going to acquire new subscribers?
Yeah.
Have those things figured out beforehand.
Know what you're aiming for. So there's always a little bit of what McCarthy calls, BS that comes up.
Yeah.
How does he handle, poorly reasoned arguments or information that just doesn't fit the data?
Well, he admits that this is an area where he could improve. He gets frustrated, which is understandable. But he recognizes that, you got to let people express their opinions, even if you disagree.
Yeah.
He also thinks it's important to explain your reasoning, why you're making a decision.
Yeah.
Even if people don't agree, at least they understand where you're coming from.
Right. So that leads us to disagree and commit.
Yeah.
And McCarthy has this interesting comparison between Spotify's Swedish culture and the American way of doing things.
Yeah, yeah. He talks about Spotify being very consensus-driven,
Okay.
which, to Americans, it can feel slow.
Yeah.
But the benefit is, like, once they make a decision, everybody's bought in.
Right.
And he contrasts this with Nick, who's sometimes just like, no, we're doing this.
Yeah.
Like the move to the clouds, for example.
Yeah.
Like, that was Eek's call.
It's happening.
It's happening.
Yeah.
And I think the big takeaway here is, be clear about who owns the decision.
Yeah.
Hold them accountable.
Yeah.
And he actually tells a story from, like, early Netflix,
Okay.
where Hastings wanted to invest in feature films.
Okay.
And Sarandos was like, no, no, no. We should focus on TV shows.
Yeah.
And Hastings, advocated for it. But ultimately, Sarandos owned the content decision.
Yeah.
And it turned out Sarandos was wrong,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
But he was held accountable, and that's the important part.
That's part of the process.
Exactly.
All right. So boards. Right.
Yeah.
Super important.
Super important.
What does McCarthy think makes a great board?
He's like, look, boards should be strategic.
Yeah.
They should provide context.
Yeah.
They should anticipate, like, the issues that are coming down the line.
Right.
The best board members, he says, they're operators.
Yeah.
They have that strategic focus.
Mm-hmm.
Functional expertise, can be helpful sometimes.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the board is dependent on management to really understand the business.
Right.
And he says, CEOs get as much out of the board as they put in.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you keep them informed,
Yeah.
you can get good guidance.
So founder-led companies, right, they have this unique dynamic with their board. How should they approach this?
Well, he points out that it's different when you have, like, a founder versus, a professional manager like himself.
Right.
In founder-led companies, especially when it's a really iconic leader, there's this tendency for board members to want to be seen as, like, strategic and supportive.
Yeah.
Right. So he emphasizes, like, founders, you got to build relationships with your board.
Yeah.
Make sure they really understand the business. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Right. Sometimes that can be hard.
It can be. So tough news, right? You got to deliver it to the board sometimes.
Yeah.
How does he handle those tough conversations?
Yeah.
Well, he's pretty self-aware.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't have the highest EQ.
Yeah.
So he often starts by just, like, asking a really direct question.
Right.
And he says, board members have to find a way to communicate that the CEO, especially a founder, can actually take on board.
Yeah.
Right? It's got to be, like, the right tone, the right message.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's tricky. So demand creation theory, this was a really interesting part of the conversation. What's McCarthy's perspective on that?
Yeah, so he uses Netflix as an example, Blockbuster, right?
Right.
They focused on new releases.
Mm-hmm.
They thought that's what people wanted.
Yeah.
But Netflix realized, like, no, people just want to watch movies they like.
It makes sense.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if it's new or old.
Right.
And so they built this massive catalog.
Yeah.
And more importantly, they started understanding individual preferences. Like, what does this person like to watch? And they started delivering personalized recommendations.
Yeah.
Daniel Ek, Spotify, same thing.
Same thing.
Huge investment in personalization.
Mm. So how does that translate into a competitive advantage, right? Like, you understand demand creation. How does that help you win?
Well, the idea is you can actually, like, demand shift people.
Okay.
Right. So if one content provider, like, raises their prices, you could subtly, like, nudge users towards, similar content.
Got it.
That's maybe cheaper from another provider.
Yeah.
And the user's still happy.
Yeah.
They're getting what they want.
But you're saving money.
You're saving money.
Yeah.
And McCarthy says, like, whoever controls demand creation, they control the gross margin.
Mm-hmm.
But he also cautions, right? Like, you got to be careful about supplier churn.
Right.
Right. Like, if the more expensive suppliers are like, hey, you're screwing me over, they might leave. Yep. And he also points out that it's really hard for suppliers to build their own, like, distribution channels.
It is.
Disney's, like, the rare success story.
Yeah, that's true. So at the end, we had that quick fire round.
Yes.
What were some of the big takeaways for you from that?
So we learned that he's basically just reading news right now.
Yeah.
Too busy for, like, leisure reading. He's super bullish on Peloton.
Long term.
Long term.
Yeah.
He thinks most people are underestimating them. He says his biggest strength is pattern matching.
Okay.
His weakness is, like, the interpersonal stuff, the EQ.
Yeah.
He says basic training was, like, a really formative experience.
Okay.
His advice to CEOs in a downturn is, like, talent density is job one.
Yeah.
And focus on your business model.
Mm.
He wouldn't pick a favorite Peloton coach.
Smart.
They're all my children, he says. He likes those 30 to 45-minute rides, zones 3 and 4.
Classic.
Classic.
Yeah.
He thinks Jay Hogue is, with this amazing board member, super resilient during the dot-com bust.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is he doesn't really think about his personal money.
Wow.
He's like, I just use it to, like, make my work life better.
Interesting.
Like
Okay.
hiring help,
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Right.
And then his outlook for the next 5 years is, like, fix Peloton.
Yeah.
Get to cash flow, break even.
Mm.
Find a successor.
Yeah.
And then go back to California.
Sounds like a plan. So to sum it all up, right?
Yeah.
Navigating the startup world,
Yeah.
leading these companies through these huge periods of growth and challenge at Netflix and Spotify, and then, revitalizing a brand like Peloton.
Yeah.
I mean, tons of knowledge here.
A lot of wisdom.
Yeah.
A lot of insights into leadership, into company culture, decision-making.
Yeah.
That whole idea of demand creation, I think there's so much here for people to, like, take away and apply to their own lives.
Absolutely. And, I think what's really interesting is we see both, his successes, but also where he feels like he needs to improve. And I think that's really valuable. Being adaptable, really understanding your business model, and recognizing that talent is key.
It's all about the people.
Yeah.
And I think his journey just shows that. Like, that's how you achieve sustained success.
Absolutely. So if you enjoyed this digest of this amazing conversation and you don't want to miss out on future ones, please hit that subscribe button.